Yeah, it's about 6:15 here.
I know.
Before we get on our trail, I want to give you a sketch of the destination ahead of us to minimize the risk of confusion. First, we're going to see an overview of Western metaphysics briefly, with its central landmark being the notion that both truth and reality are a kind of primordial light. Then I'll present Heidegger's critique of this idea of being as light or presence, and his emphasis on the poetic or aesthetic cognition as the way out. Once there, we'll be able to follow this to object-oriented ontology, holding tightly to Heidegger's insight into a positively dark aspect of being, but breaking beyond his limits into profound new territory for Western metaphysics, oddly closer to the fourfold balance and mixture of light and dark we find in the Tao. Finally, I'll conclude with a central paradox found in Triple O, that aesthetics is the root of all causation. So with that summary out of the way, here we go. It has been said that the story of Western philosophy starts with a man named Thales, walking alone at night. Mesmerized by the stars above him, with his head tilted back, he fell straight down into a well. This will serve as a wonderful image for what's about to happen in Western metaphysics for the next couple millennia, with a few great exceptions. But really, the story of Western philosophy, I think, should begin on the backdrop of its original great poems and scriptures. So a century or two before Thales lived the great blind poet Homer. Homer, it was thought, had encapsulated the whole of human wisdom into his encyclopedic long poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were recited by heart and maintained by a strict oral tradition. These works actually have a striking similarity to the Chinese I Ching, which tightly organized the culture's collective wisdom, as well as the Torah, which did the same for the Hebrews. These works organized everything from the model for an ideal person to arithmetic, poetry, and even architectural instructions. They were taken for ages as the concrete beginning and end of wisdom, a home and center of gravity for the psyche and the culture as a whole. But then came Socrates and his student Plato, thought by most as the first truly great and significant philosophers in the West. They began seeing the people around them who were simply buying into these scriptures and these myths wholesale as being like cave dwellers, never looking outside to see the light of truth for themselves, but only chasing the shadows cast by others who had come before them, namely Homer, Moses, and so on. So philosophy began not as the mere acceptance of these canons of myth and cultural wisdom, but a challenge to them, to love wisdom for oneself and for itself. So for these first philosophers, it was taken as a kind of blasphemy against the true and good and beautiful to presume that they had already been fully manifest and canonized in the past. And the impetus for this highly abstract philosophical revolution was the invention of a new hallucinogenic drug making its way across the Mediterranean Sea, the phonetic alphabet. As Heidegger once said, mankind is not so much the master of language as much as language is the master of mankind. And he also said that language, right, is the home, the true home and dwelling of the mind. So the phonetic alphabet was originally invented by slaves who were forbidden from reading the hieroglyphs in Egypt, reducing thousands of unique pictographs into just 25 utterly meaningless phonemes. And this vast distillation of language came with both unprecedented benefits for abstract thought, but also unforeseeable psychosocial costs. It marked a divorce of language from both its pictorial and oral traditions. This alphabetized West became the first to arrive at many new innovations and wisdoms, but also the first to abandon and forget old ones. Instead of a shared canon of codified myths and images, the alphabet actually forced individuals to abstractly conjure images and concepts for themselves much more frequently than they did in the past, it also led to an overall preference for the eye over the ear as the common sense. For some, this new dwelling of abstract space, opened by this new form of language, felt like pure freedom. But for many, the psychological effects of this new mode of cognition were just too abstract. So haunting every word and thought and image was the question, do we mean the same thing by this or that? Am I imagining this right? Are we on the same page? So each person was under a new kind of pressure to discern true from false for themselves. And with this, a new habit formed to compensate for this loss of shared concrete meanings. This habit was the abstract separation and purification of truth from falsehood, from all falsehood, and good from all evil, light from all darkness, and kind of locking them into separate realms, never to touch. And I'll term this the hylomorphic habit. And its kind of resulting metaphysics was, you have a blurry lump of darkness or dead matter below, shaped by light forms above. Quite literally, a lot like writing on a blank sheet of paper. Along with this radically abstract and hylomorphic enlightenment, there developed a notion of reason as a kind of pure light, goodness, and the true, and also the truth of being itself. That the absolute of being was like a realm of pure light forms, which could simply be followed by the light of our own reason. This notion of light and form became the grounding metaphor for truth and being in Western philosophy. But an unforeseen consequence of this grounding metaphor of light was that it left the notion of darkness to be correlated with just ignorance, negation, nothingness, and even death. We see this exemplified in Plato, whose own metaphysics of pure ideal forms, or logos, which means words, right, was an abstract realm of these perfect light forms above, from which everything below is just a shadowy derivation. And also we see it in kind of Parmenides, for instance, in his proposition that the light of thinking and speaking and being are the same. We'll see soon exactly where this account of being falls short, and ultimately how it cannot give an account of space and time. But before moving on to its ramifications, the ramifications of this habit in the modern West, I want to point out there's an interesting historical note here. Plato lived around the same time as Buddha. Halfway across the globe, Buddha and the early Taoists were emphasizing a darkness, even an emptiness, at the center of the psyche and the cosmos, which is otherwise clouded by bright, shiny illusions and abstractions, which are to be treated with some skepticism. And while the West was at this time enjoying many abstract innovations, the Tao and its yin-yang in the East were already intermixing and balancing the light and dark aspects of being, quite distinct and more so free, I think, of this hylomorphic habit of locking light and dark into separate realms which never touch. So now we'll skip ahead to another great epoch in Western philosophy, the invention of the printing press, which unleashed the glory and catastrophe of the abstract alphabetic mind into the mainstream, almost instantly giving rise to vast religious reformations in favor of individual interpretations, right, like the Protestant Reformation, for example, and also political revolutions, like the French Revolution or the American Revolution, overthrowing the old concrete monopoly of kings and emperors previously held in place by myths and oral authority. There was also at this time a great scientific revolution and its corresponding enlightenment. It appeared as though the light of man's own reason was on track to completely unveil the deepest, darkest mysteries of being. Meanwhile, the philosophers became more self-conscious about this pursuit of pure light, the pure light of truth and being, and found themselves torn between two competing notions of truth and being, as primordial light, either finding the limits and paradoxes of this pursuit or making a last-ditch effort to unveil it in either idealism or materialism. Descartes, often called the first modern philosopher, demonstrated a hard limit on the light of human reason, with a radical skepticism, that you cannot know for certain that any of your beliefs or senses, right, the light of reason, you can't be sure about it, that it's true about anything, just that it's there, right, just that you are thinking or sensing. Likewise, Kant articulated the limits of the light of pure reason by emphasizing the unclosable gap between presence for us and being in itself. The moment we think of something outside the mind, he said, it is instantly filtered and distorted and transformed into something merely for us. Despite our progress in science and logic, we ultimately remain trapped in the cave of ourselves and can say nothing about reality in itself. So consequently, the modern Western metaphysics was marked by the view that the light of human reason and knowledge was perhaps a mere simulation or semblance or distortion of the real, no longer thought capable of simply and directly accessing the real in itself. Either that or that there was no reality outside the mind at all, i.e. full idealism, right? And the materialists, though they claimed that the light of human reason is a material result, a material byproduct, they ultimately thought that it could be literally and explicitly unveiled by the light of reason. So, and then to address idealism here for a moment, Hegel countered Kant and held that indeed the world was the pure light of absolute spirit or mind, and this could be known through an odd kind of certainty. For Hegel, there was a dark aspect, finally, right? A negativity in all self-conscious humans. For instance, when we face the future, we face a darkness, and upon this darkness, we negate the negation, as Hegel says, meaning we project our own conscious light. And this projection of imagination and prediction was, for Hegel, a kind of knowledge that consciousness carried this primordial light that we'd all been searching for from the beginning, right? His absolute knowledge. And that this ray of light could lead us to a world spirit, a kind of internet realm of pure spirit, right? And while I think this is a beautiful articulation of spirit and the light of consciousness, it does not in any way, in my view, get us beyond ourselves, as it merely paints the light of awareness as if it were the absolute of being, skipping over any account of its source or ground. And the idea that there's a purer realm over the rainbow is just an assertion, at best an idealistic hope. On top of this, Hegel ultimately fails to hold this light-dark in balance, as even the negation of darkness by consciousness is opposed to or even washed away by any absolute knowledge whatsoever. And Nietzsche, then, I think, gave what is the most profound critique of the idealist doctrines, that there's a truer, better, other world over the rainbow. His critique was that this other world of pure, ideal forms and truths and gods actually drained this world of its value. Therefore, these abstract ideals we make always backfire against their original hope and become as uncertain and as unbelievable as they really are. We find, kind of like Kant showed, right, that they're mere images, mere distortions and illusions. Yeah. You're muted, I think.
So there are people who wanted to enter into a meeting room but haven't.
Oh, okay.
So you could continue now.
Okay. Maybe I should give a very brief summary of what's gone on so far.
Yeah, please do.
From the beginning of Western philosophy, there's been kind of this hylomorphism, a separation of light and dark, absolutely, right? So the metaphysical view is kind of that there's a darkness or dead matter below, formless, dead, dark matter below, and a kind of noble or pure light above. And so I've just been tracing this hylomorphism through Western philosophy, and right now we are at idealists who think that being itself is made of this primordial light, and then materialists who think that even though consciousness may be a material byproduct, it can, in the end, be explicitly and completely unveiled by the light of reason. Therefore, these abstract ideals, Nietzsche says, in absolute light forms, which initially fill us with a kind of sense of pride and certainty, ultimately always backfire, right? This is what he means by nihilism, that they backfire against their original hope and become as uncertain and unbelievable as they really are. We find they're always just mere man-made images, and never, as Kant showed, accessing pure reality in itself. So even our greatest logics seem to be nothing but a working metaphor for the ground of being. So this gave way to the existentialist and postmodern philosophies. And all our old philosophies, religions, and values were finally seen for what they were, mere images. And there's no hidden depth to a mere image, right? And there's no ground beyond them that could be verified without instantly returning to this circle of fiction, right? There was only our own light, shining only in our own finite cave. And there's no way outside of ourselves. No pure access could be found. It's kind of like Thales again. We're looking up at the stars and we fall into a well, which is how philosophy in the West started. And I think there's a similar movement that actually happened in China under the banner of the Mara poets and philosophers, deconstructing old myths and political structures, which they claimed relied on mere images. So here, we're going to move to what I think is really exciting, Heidegger's critique of this entire history we've been following. Having gone all the way through the doom and gloom situation of modern Western metaphysics, we can shift our attention to Heidegger, who stands as a dark gem in modern philosophy, and is perhaps the greatest critic of this default metaphysics of putting the light of presence above and raw, meaningless nothingness underneath. His philosophy began just riding the mainstream of current Western philosophy. In fact, the branch he started on was the pinnacle of it, phenomenology, where anything which did not directly and immediately appear to the human mind was just left aside. That we had nothing to talk about reality outside the mind. But something about this finally broke in Heidegger's mind, and he couldn't take it a second longer. Following Kant and Nietzsche, he knew there was no simply going back to the old tribal, dogmatic, pseudo-solutions, nor could he simply go forward into a hope of pure logic, science, or immediate sensation, kind of like Hegel did, to magically get us outside of ourselves. He saw essentially that the rationalist and the mystic both were falsely claiming to unveil direct access to reality, only differing in using either intellectual or spiritual means. So he turned to the most basic question, the question of being, trying somehow to bypass the failed presumptions that the light of human awareness could give us direct truth, the direct truth of being itself. Here's a quote from Heidegger on that. If our question, why is there being rather than nothing, is taken in its fullest sense, we must avoid singling out any special particular being, including man. Heidegger's first groundbreaking insight was that the vast majority of the reality we relate to and depend on every day never even enters conscious awareness to begin with, right? Our organs, function invisibly to us, right, in the dark background, without us having to think about them, and usually without us seeing them, unless there's like a catastrophic event, maybe, or a waking surgery, that kind of thing. And likewise, the Earth's mantle below us, formed long before humans or even organic matter, silently and invisibly supports the foundation of the building you're in, and supports the floor beneath your feet. All these realities support you without breaking into thought, unless attention is explicitly drawn to them. The norm is for reality to withdraw. That's a key word in Heidegger, to withdraw from access into the unseen background. And his most famous example of this is in his tool analysis, which Graham Harman loves to bring up. When tools are functioning, right, they kind of fall into the background, and unless they malfunction, or I should say only when they malfunction, do we become aware of them as tools, right, beyond their function or their content. The great thing about Heidegger breaking him from this tradition of this metaphysics of light is he really takes this dark aspect of being very seriously. This dark, veiled, inarticulable aspect of being, rather than taking it as a failure of human reason or some indication that reality itself was just a grand fiction, negation, or nothingness, Heidegger affirmed this background of being as that which is simply too deep to be reduced to any image whatsoever. So a kind of essential darkness supports all of our images, all of our relations. And it can never be reduced down to these images without collapsing this support structure. Heidegger's second radical insight about the positive darkness of being is made clear and simple in a letter to a young student published in his epilogue to his essay, The Thing. Here he makes this argument. Not only is the reality outside us essentially dark and veiled, but even the light of our own consciousness within. Every view, thought, image, or access that we have to the world must itself emerge from this same supportive darkness. We never ultimately know where our thoughts come from, and they cannot be known until after they've already arrived. The point is, we cannot even say that the light of consciousness in the mind ever exhaustively illuminates even our own interior. So we don't even fully ever know or illuminate ourselves any more than we can directly unveil the true depths of the world outside of us. So there's an essential darkness in both directions, on both ends of human light. So in a final critique against Hegel and his hope for pure self-consciousness, Heidegger says this: Hegel's negativity is not true negativity because it never takes seriously the not and the nihilative. It has already sublimated the not into the yes, the dark into the light. So it might seem here that the primary target for Heidegger would be idealism or fictionalism, the idea that reality is just a mere fiction for us humans. But this notion of idealism and fictionalism for Heidegger is just too easily and swiftly crushed by just a request like, give me an account for the ground of this consciousness or these images. So he thinks that's kind of too easy, and instead the stronger, more pernicious enemy for Heidegger is not fictionalism or idealism, but actually literalism. The idea that reality itself can be paraphrased in literal terms. So Heidegger is kind of saying that all truths, when taken too literally, as pure, direct, or complete access to reality, are always found to be just mythic images or distortions, kind of like Kant said, right? And there's a way in which literalizing surfaces everything to mere presence. Just as if closing one eye were taken as the solution for the problem of depth, every attempt to literalize the cosmos, whether as matter or as idea always merely disables half of the situation, or half of cognition. And the claim here is not that logic and science are nonsense, even though Heidegger is famous for saying, science doesn't think. It's not quite so simple. They're not nonsense and dogma. It's quite the opposite. They are the perfection of sense. Science and logic are the perfection of sense, but they're sense nonetheless. Like we ourselves, these extensions cannot reach outside of themselves and be verified against some final bedrock of concrete reality in itself. So, having emphasized the structural importance of darkness and admitting that no literal interpretation or immediate presentation of being can ever do it justice, we must next uncover the specific mode of cognition in philosophy, which does not reduce things to thought, but instead retains their depths in their own rightful place, their own ontological space and time, whether seen, used, or far on the other side of the cosmos. So paradoxically, it's by maintaining a gap between the light of presence and the dark of what really is that we can even begin to do justice to reality. So to paraphrase the first philosophers, it's a blasphemy against the real to claim that it could ever be reduced to one image or presence of it. And without maintaining this radical gap between presence and the dark of unknowing, we actually slip into dogma and nihilism, where all notions are equal and what's essential comes up flat. So the struggle now is to find, weirdly, a non-literal realism. And this is where we get the origin of the work of art, Heidegger's surprisingly metaphysical masterpiece, where he finds a strange link between the creation of art and the production of genuine truths. Whereas Hegel before him, in his lectures on aesthetics, in some sense, he thought that art had reached its own historical end and was instead giving way to a kind of idealist science of pure knowing. Heidegger here begins to think of art as a structural constant. It's something necessary for any presentation of being whatsoever. So breaking with the traditional concepts of pure light and their final idealized images, Heidegger starts to use this language of, the withheld dark model of being as veiling or folding or withholding. And access to these depths was more like listening in, or you'll hear this term attunement, rather than, say, flatly seeing, right? So you're tuning into being rather than flatly seeing it. And he'll say, this is to let reality ring out of its own accord, like a bell, right? This is where we find Heidegger's privileged account of metaphorical, analogical, or aesthetic cognition, rather than idealist or materialist, literalized cognition. The poetic for Heidegger is not merely an ornament, it's not just pretty, it is our dwelling. The metaphorical, in some sense, is the root of our psyche. He says, poetically man dwells, over and over again. And this is what's so amazing about metaphor, right? Without metaphor, language is restricted to semantics, and learning, genuine thinking, become impossible. We are reduced to pre-programmed automatons. Whereas in usual literal speech and thought, language really does the thinking for us. As Heidegger, remember, originally said, man is not the master of language, language is the master of man. In metaphor, we get an exception to this. Because in moments of genuine insight and exploration, language kind of breaks down and we're forced to bend and break language. Metaphor, analogy, allusion, and poetry is for when language reaches or is pushed beyond its literal limits, images, ideas, and concepts. So metaphor is not mere presence, right? This is why it's exceptional for Heidegger. One, because metaphor only occurs at the genuine dark edges of presence, right? When presence fails to grasp something. And two, it in fact carries the power to augment, to change presences. Art, poetry, and true science and analogical cognition do not merely represent the world to us, they shape, extend, and enhance our very psyche. This is why Heidegger says that the artwork makes the artist no less than the artist makes the artwork. To kind of sum all this up into an image here, or a metaphor, right? Rather than being like a flat image, metaphor is more like one situation seen through the lens of another situation, right? So there's some depth there. Analogy has the special capacity to explore hidden depths without reducing them to a fully literalized presence. Metaphor is not the mere image conflated with the real, but admits a gap and makes use of this distance between what really is and what can possibly be brought to literal presence for us. Each new word, each new concept is originally a metaphor. Often these sink into the background, just like well-functioning tools or organs do. And we've already noticed that logic, for instance, in Nietzsche, is ultimately just our working metaphor for the ground of things, which isn't to downplay its usefulness and its importance, but only to show that it is a secondary kind of cognition to analogy. Analogy, not logic, must be the root of cognition itself. Although Heidegger, again, said science doesn't think, the working scientist is never merely a literalizer, insofar as they're still experimenting and exploring. They confront reality afresh, even breaking with the old models, right? The thinking scientist is like an artist, opposed to those who passively accept scientific models as complete and literal. It's like the difference between a creative songwriter and someone who just presses the play button. Very big difference between doing science and just accepting scientific results. So analogy, again, is the true root of cognition. In fact, it kind of has to be. There's a really interesting neuroscientific finding that we literally don't have enough neurons or atoms in our brain to map on to every image, concept, and idea. We have to use kind of metaphorical cognition to triangulate these things, right? And if you want to look into that, it is called the grandma neuron. That's what that problem is called. So, really fantastic. That's a great reference there. So, yeah, moving on. Here, we can finally make a clear distinction between logic and analogy. Analogy is allusion, right? Kind of pointing to an excess or a depth in itself, whereas logic is more of a reduction, right? A reduction to a surface, a presence for us. Excuse me. So what would an ontology built on this root of cognition look like? Not its flattened, literalized results. It would recognize the asymmetrical excesses and incompleteness of being itself. Such an ontology must resist ever collapsing one situation into another, right? Which is what metaphor is good at not doing. Metaphor is good at not collapsing one situation into another, but seeing one situation through another, right? So you keep that depth there, right? So if you collapse one situation into another, it bankrupts any account of essence and space. What is essence if not the distinction between a situation from its context And what is space, if not the gap between some depth and a separate surface? Despite these groundbreaking ontological insights of Heidegger, though, where Western philosophy is finally, giving a good treatment to the dark aspect of things, that this withheld darkness is always deeper than any light or presence outside of it, the final result of Heidegger looks something like one big black hole where all entities except humans are kind of blurred together or fused into one undifferentiated background. So there's a black hole of reality, and although it's ungraspably deep and supportive, it serves as kind of little more for Heidegger than a mere stage beneath the kaleidoscopic play of human presence. So although reality here is finally treated to exist just fine without human awareness, Heidegger, in the end, holds that in order to be differentiated into objects, into discrete things, there has to be a human on the scene, right? Doing this differentiating. Without this conscious awareness, all other beings of the world are termed world poor or worldless by Heidegger. There's no difference between the sea and a seashell. The monkey and its tree are essentially one unit. Here's a sentence from Heidegger. In the last sentence of The Thing, he writes this: "Men alone, by dwelling, strain to the world as world. Only what conjoins itself out of his world becomes a thing." So only man differentiates things into things. So here, Heidegger himself, unfortunately, reverts to this old hylomorphism I mentioned, of some special human light above in its own world, and a formless darkness or fused darkness. And here he fails to follow through, essentially, on his plan of not privileging human access. Ultimately, he fails to escape the hylomorphic, anthropocentric stalemate, which he initially attempted, which renders an anthropocentric taxonomy with humans above and a blur of everything else below. And we'll see that more than just being human-centered, this fails to account for the very nature of emergence and time. And so finally, this is the last bit here. This is on object-oriented ontology. Here we finally move to Graham Harman's object-oriented critique of Heidegger's big black hole, right? This fusedness that needs a human to differentiate it. And I personally view Graham Harman's critique here as no less profound than Heidegger's own critique of the metaphysics of presence. Just as the history of Western philosophy has struggled with the one hylomorphic habit of attempting to erase the distinctions between reality and appearance once and for all, it also suffered from another habit, right, that we see Heidegger get sucked into, which is attempting to get rid of things themselves in order to arrive at some final united ground of being. So Heidegger masterfully escapes the first aspect of hylomorphism by showing that being can't be collapsed into any presence of it, but fails in the other, collapsing beings into being as one whole. And this leaves him with a bankrupt account of emergence and time. Every iteration of hylomorphism ultimately reduced things up to a mere flat presence of knowledge or images or mind, or reduce them down to an already interconnected, formless, dead matter or whole below, and usually both habits at once. Though I do want to note here, there are two important exceptions to fusing everything into one being, and that's Aristotle with his substances, his discrete substances, and Leibniz with his monads. And if things were really just reduced to one final ground underneath, we would have no way to account for emergence, identity, and ultimately space, because things would have no real distance from each other and being fused on arrival. What Harman terms undermining. Undermining is when things are reduced to their parts, negating their own emergent presences. Likewise, if things were already linked in some upper surface, interconnected presence, we'd lose any account for change, as they would already be mere projections in the mind of a beholder and carry none of their own withheld capacity to surprise or change the mind, supposedly projecting them, which clearly they must. Harman terms this overmining, when things are reduced up to their effects. And duomining is both reductions at the same time. So what is the solution Harman gives to these reductions? To expand beyond Heidegger's insight, he breaks up this big black hole into a cosmos filled to the brim with little black holes, right? Of different scales, really. To discover this self-withholding structure in every object whatsoever, not just for being as a whole, but for every situation. To accomplish this, all things in Harman are treated initially on the same footing, and we don't make a ranking of entities, we don't pretend to know which is more real than any other, only that, whether real or illusory, all things simply can't be identical to each other. The first principle is non-contradiction in this investigation. If any distinction is to be found among entities, it can't be presumed. Presumption does not solve paradoxes. It in fact hides them. So what is a real object in principle, right? We can't know them directly. They're withheld from our access. So there must be some kind of principle. A real object is simply anything which cannot be reduced to any other. Not just the smallest pieces which make up some whole. It's anything which cannot be exchanged with its pieces nor its effects. And one interesting consequence of this ontology is that the depths of things here are not only veiled from us humans, but also from each other, right? Just by sheer reality. To quote Harman on that, when the things withdraw from presence into their dark subterranean reality, they distance themselves not only from humans, but from each other as well. This means that, contrary to the dominant assumption of philosophy since Kant, the true chasm in ontology lies not between humans and world, but objects and relations. This duality holds equally true for all entities in the cosmos, whether natural, artificial, organic, or fully human. And that's from Tool Being. Perhaps the most pernicious and popular superstition in the West, even today, around me, and it drives me nuts, is that everything exclusively exists for human consciousness. You know, the world is just a stage, or is just props for us humans. Or even that existence is generated by us merely looking at it, or thinking or speaking. Like Parmenides said, thinking, speaking, and being are the same. But just think of how this alters our evaluation of ecology. The natural value of the world is immediately lessened, and the mystery of beings is drained into dead matter for us alone to give shape and value. Tripolo stands alone as a total rejection of these hylomorphic extremes and their nihilistic consequences. In my view, Tripolo, again, object-oriented ontology, serves as a deep grammatical correction or restoration of a kind of center of gravity for this abstract metaphysical thinker. In object-oriented ontology, we find ourselves very far from materialism and idealism and their ontological consequences, instead laying the groundwork for an all-encompassing ontology of things, capable of accounting for a multitude of identities, causes, emergences, changes, and, importantly, space and time. But there's one problem here, if if object-oriented ontology is right, that things withdraw from each other and are veiled, just like we are, from reality, like genuine black holes, never reducible to each other, how do things ever relate whatsoever? And this is the last part here, where we get to the problem of aesthetic causation. It is clear that things cannot act upon other realities directly and unproblematically any more than we ourselves can. There can be no direct and unproblematic access between two distinct realities without collapsing the account of essence, space, and time. But on the other hand, how could things emerge and change when their very essence is in withholding themselves and exclusively being what they are and not otherwise? A wonderful concept that we already learned in Heidegger's Origin of the Work of Art is here revived and expanded. It's not merely that metaphor is the root of our cognition, but somehow it must serve as a model for causation as a whole, because things cannot literally and directly relate to one another. They have to have analogs or sensual mediators to relate. So just as human knowledge and use both filter other realities through our terms, no access by any object can relate directly, and all relations distort. As Harman puts it, we distort when we see, and distort when we use. Nor is the sin of caricature merely a human vice. Dogs do not make contact with the full reality of bones, and neither do locusts with corn stalks, or viruses with cells, nor rocks with windows, nor planets with moons. It is not human consciousness alone that distorts the reality of things, but relationality per se. When a hailstorm smashes vineyards or sends waves through a pond, these relations are just as worthy of philosophy as the unceasing dispute over the chasm or non-chasm of being and thought." Unquote. Though Heidegger restricted the power of creative analogy to humans, seeing atoms, chemicals, plants, and animals as running on a fused circuit board of just blind instinct, world poor or worldless, we must reassess this claim, not least because living and language-structured consciousness cannot serve as the starting point, but must somehow be the result of something more primordial, an analogical structure, pre-human, and folded up in being itself. As Wyndham Lewis once put it, the artist is older than the fish. All relation must somehow be artful by default, not mindlessly interconnected, following preset laws or instincts, or simply the demands of its pieces. There can be no direct paths in the cosmos without bankrupting space and time. Oddly like the structure of metaphor, where one situation is seen through the lens of another without being flattened to it, Harman calls this aesthetic causation. This is where we make the axiomatic distinction between real and sensual objects, not as two separate realms, as philosophy has been doing in the West for so many years, for ages, but as two aspects within individual things themselves as soon as they relate. Real objects withdraw from any view or access to them, but sensual objects do the opposite and work to fuse depths without having any real depth of their own, being merely the analog of one reality to another. So there's a positive aspect of darkness now that we've finally sussed out in Western metaphysics. No longer as mere nothingness, ignorance, formlessness, nor deception, but the withheld structure of beings themselves. Last page here. Now here, in the surface rub of these depths, these dark depths, we finally find a positive aspect of light. No longer belonging to just the abstract human thinker, the visual observer, or a Platonic ideal realm, but as a necessary, if still mysterious, account of how dark, distinct realities ever connect and relate in the first place. The resulting ontology must therefore be something like dark grounds or objects which relate through mere phosphorescent surfaces. Light, presence, and sensuality, and I would even say spirit, emerges only between the relation, the friction between these dark realities. So light may not be pure reality itself, as philosophy in the West thought for so long, but it may play a critical role in relations. Here's a conclusion. The ontology and the language we use to articulate the world are critical. It's not that the alphabet is just a damned linguistic technology, but every technology, every language, comes with its own powers and deficits, its own dangers. So I invite you to do an analysis of your own language, the structure of your own language, for its powers and dangers. Language, as Heidegger told us in the beginning, is the house we dwell, and we saw metaphor gives us a window or a door to the outside world. We have also seen that our ontology is quite literally our view of everything, and it is critical in both theory and ethics to get it exactly right, despite our internal reductive habits and premature desire for truth. I love how Tsai-Yi put this in a recent paper on metaphor. In a metaphor, the thinker creates not the thing, but the meanings of the thing, or our relationship with things. I want to add that just as there's an eternal and structural gap which gives the power of reality to shape truths, what is good and beautiful is not merely what pleases us, it is what has the power to even change what pleases us because of its sheer goodness and beauty. Art and metaphor has the power not only to express how we see the world more accurately, but it has the power to change the way we see the world. What we think, we become, and the metaphors we use become our common sense, whether we like it or not. A mere word or idea can shape us. The articulation of our metaphysics is the lens we look through onto life, which can then shape our relations, then also the world itself. Thank you. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's really impressive.
Thank you.
I enjoy your refreshing vocabulary a lot.
Thank you.
Just the way you put it is so refreshing.
Cool.
And it has a lot of insight. It's very personal too. I really have seen a thinker who speaks so closely relate to your own heart.